There's a photograph that should not exist. It was taken in the summer of 1963 in a town that refuses to acknowledge it ever happened. In the image, 7 men stand in a row, fathers and sons, grandfathers and great-grandfathers, all sharing the same hollow expression, the same haunted eyes. Within 10 years, 3 of them would be dead, 2 would disappear without explanation, and 1 would spend the rest of his life trying to tell the world what the Rookwood men had been doing in the basement of that house for over a century. The town called him a liar, the family called him a traitor, but the evidence he left behind tells a different story entirely. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. What you're about to hear is not folklore. It's not legend or campfire myth. This is the documented history of the Rookwood family, a lineage that began in 1837 and continued, unbroken, until 1989. For 5 generations, every son born into this family inherited something far darker than land or money. They inherited knowledge of what their fathers had done, what their grandfathers had done, and what they, in turn, would be expected to do. The Rookwood estate sat on 40 acres just outside a small Pennsylvania town that we'll call Ashford. The family owned mills, employed half the county, and donated generously to the church. They were respected, untouchable, but inside that house, behind walls that were built thicker than any neighbor thought necessary, a ritual was being passed down father to son that defied every moral boundary known to civilized society. And the most disturbing part, every son accepted it. Every son participated, until one didn't. The Rookwood line begins with a man named Cornelius Rookwood, who arrived in Pennsylvania in 1837 with a young wife, a trunk full of medical instruments, and a letter of introduction from a European university that no longer exists. He purchased land on the outskirts of Ashford when the town was barely a collection of farmhouses and a general store. He built his estate deliberately far from neighbors. He built it with stone walls 2 feet thick, and he built it with a basement that extended far deeper than any home of that era required. Cornelius was a physician, or so he claimed. Town records show he treated illnesses, set broken bones, and delivered babies. He was educated, soft-spoken, and generous with his time. But there were whispers even then. Whispers about patients who went to see him and were never quite the same afterward, about treatments that required days of isolation in his home, about the sounds that occasionally drifted from the estate late at night, sounds that could have been animals, or machinery, or something else entirely. In 1842, his wife gave birth to their only child, a son named Edmund. She died 3 days later from what the death certificate listed as childbed fever. Cornelius never remarried. He raised Edmund alone in that house, and those who knew the boy said he grew up strange, quiet, obedient to the point of being unsettling. By the time Edmund was 12 years old, he no longer attended school. His father claimed he was being educated at home, learning medicine and the family trade. What that trade actually entailed would not be understood for another 140 years. When Cornelius died in 1870, Edmund inherited everything: the house, the land, the medical practice, and something else, something that was never written in any will or recorded in any legal document. Edmund was 38 years old when his father passed, and within 6 months, he married a woman 20 years his junior. Within a year, she gave birth to a son. The pattern was established: 1 son per generation, 1 inheritor of the Rookwood legacy. And with each passing generation, the secret grew heavier, more elaborate, and more impossible to escape. Edmund Rookwood's son was named Thaddeus, born in 1871. Like his father before him, Thaddeus grew up isolated within the estate's stone walls. But unlike previous generations, we have more documentation of Thaddeus's life letters he wrote as a young man, diary entries from neighbors, and a particularly disturbing journal that would later be discovered hidden in the walls of the Rookwood basement. In one entry, dated 1886, 15-year-old Thaddeus wrote, "Father showed me the room today. He says every Rookwood man must see it on his 15th birthday. He says it is our burden and our purpose. I did not sleep last night. I do not think I will sleep again for a very long time." What was in that room? For decades, no one outside the family knew. But what we do know is that after Thaddeus was shown whatever his father wanted him to see, his personality changed dramatically. Teachers who had known him described a boy who had been curious and talkative, suddenly becoming withdrawn and mechanical. He stopped asking questions. He stopped making eye contact. One schoolteacher wrote in a letter to her sister, "Young Thaddeus Rookwood looks at you as though he is seeing through you into some dark place beyond. I fear for that boy's soul." Thaddeus married in 1893 and had a son, named Samuel, in 1894. His wife died in 1900, cause of death listed as pneumonia, though the town doctor noted in his private records that he found the circumstances medically inconsistent. Thaddeus raised Samuel alone, just as his father and grandfather had done before him. The pattern was unmistakable now. The Rookwood men did not keep wives. They produced one male heir, and the mother inevitably died young, leaving father and son alone in that house to continue whatever tradition was being preserved within its walls. Samuel Rookwood came of age during World War I. He was drafted in 1917, but received a medical exemption signed by his own father claiming a heart condition. He never left Ashford. He never left the estate. And in 1922, at age 28, he married a woman from a neighboring county who had no family and no connections to the town. She gave birth to a son named Richard in 1923. She was dead by 1925. Richard Rookwood was born into a world that was rapidly modernizing, but inside the stone walls of the estate, time seemed to stand still. By the 1930s, the Rookwood family's wealth had only grown. They owned 3 mills, a significant portion of Ashford's real estate, and had investments that stretched across Pennsylvania. Samuel Rookwood was a pillar of the community, a member of the town council, a church deacon, a man whose word carried weight. And yet those who worked closely with him noticed something profoundly unsettling. He never smiled, not once, not at weddings, not at celebrations, not even when his businesses thrived. He moved through life with the mechanical precision of a man fulfilling an obligation rather than living. Richard grew up during the Great Depression, though the Rookwood fortune insulated him from its worst effects. Neighbors recall seeing him as a child, always alone, always watching from the windows of the estate. They had no friends. He attended school irregularly, and when he did attend, he sat in the back and spoke to no one. A teacher from that era, interviewed decades later before her death, said something chilling. Richard knew things no child should know. Once, during a lesson on human anatomy, he corrected me. He described the nervous system in detail that I myself did not understand. When I asked where he learned this, he said his father had shown him. He was only 11 years old. On Richard's 15th birthday in 1938, something happened that a housemaid witnessed by accident. She had been hired to clean the upper floors of the estate and had arrived earlier than expected. She later told her family, though never the police, never officially, that she heard screaming coming from below the house. Not the screaming of pain, she said, but the screaming of someone who had just seen something that shattered their understanding of the world. When Richard emerged from the basement hours later with his father, the maid said his face was grey. He walked past her as if she didn't exist. His eyes, she said, looked like they belonged to someone who had died but forgotten to stop moving. Richard married in 1946, shortly after returning from World War II, where he had served as a medic. His wife, a nurse he met in Philadelphia, was pregnant within months. She gave birth to a son named Thomas in 1947, and just like every Rookwood wife before her, she did not live long. She died in 1949. The official cause was listed as an accidental fall down the basement stairs. She was 26 years old. Thomas Rookwood was the 5th generation. Born in 1947, he grew up in a post-war America that was optimistic, forward-looking, and desperate to forget the horrors it had just witnessed. But inside the Rookwood estate, the old rituals continued unchanged. Richard raised his son with the same cold precision his father had used on him, the same isolation, the same careful preparation for the inheritance that awaited him on his 15th birthday. But Thomas was different. From the very beginning, people noticed something in him that had been absent in previous generations' resistance. As a child, Thomas asked questions. He pushed back against his father's rules. He tried to make friends at school despite being forbidden. A classmate from those years, interviewed in 2003, remembered Thomas as desperate for normalcy. He wanted to be like everyone else so badly, she said. He'd come to school and just watch us play, like he was studying how normal kids behaved, but his father always came to pick him up exactly at 3 o'clock, never late, never early, and Thomas would change the moment he saw that car. His whole body would go rigid. In 1962, Thomas turned 15. What happened on that birthday has been pieced together from journal entries, psychiatric records, and testimony Thomas himself would give decades later. Richard took his son into the basement, just as every Rookwood father had done before him. He showed Thomas the room. He explained the family's purpose. He revealed what had been happening in that basement since 1837, and for the first time in 5 generations, a Rookwood son refused. Thomas ran. He made it as far as the sheriff's office in downtown Ashford, hysterical and incoherent, trying to explain what he had seen. But Richard Rookwood was a powerful man. Within 2 hours, Thomas was back home, and the sheriff had been convinced that the boy was having a mental breakdown brought on by adolescent stress. No investigation was opened. No questions were asked. And Thomas learned a lesson that would haunt him for the next 27 years. No one would believe him. No one would help him. He was trapped. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. Thomas Rookwood lived the next 27 years in a state of psychological warfare with his own existence. He went through the motions. He graduated high school. He attended college, though his father insisted he live at home and commute. He worked in the family business, and in 1972, under enormous pressure from Richard, he married. Her name was Catherine Marsh, a schoolteacher from Ohio with no ties to Ashford and no knowledge of the Rookwood family history. She was kind, optimistic, and wholly unprepared for what she had married into. Catherine became pregnant in 1973. For months, Thomas barely spoke. Those close to the couple said he seemed to be in mourning, though no one had died. When Catherine gave birth to a son in February of 1974, witnesses at the hospital said Thomas wept not with joy, but with something that looked like despair. He held his newborn son and whispered, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." The nurses assumed it was exhaustion. Catherine assumed it was overwhelming emotion. Neither understood that Thomas was apologizing for bringing another generation into a nightmare that had no end. They named the boy Michael. And for the first time in Rookwood history, a father began planning not to pass the inheritance forward, but to destroy it entirely. Thomas became obsessed. He started documenting everything his father had told him. He began researching the family history, going through old records, old journals, old documents that had been locked away for generations. He made copies. He hid them in safety deposit boxes in 3 different states. He contacted lawyers, though he could never bring himself to tell them the full truth. And he watched his son grow, knowing that in 15 years, Richard would expect the tradition to continue. But in 1979, Richard Rookwood died suddenly of a heart attack. He was 67 years old. Thomas was now the sole keeper of the family secret, and for the first time in 142 years, there was no older generation to enforce the ritual. Thomas had a choice. He could break the pattern, or he could become his father. Catherine later testified that the night Richard died, Thomas locked himself in his study and didn't emerge for 3 days. When he finally came out, he had made his decision. He was going to end this. He was going to expose everything, and he was going to do it before Michael turned 15. In 1987, when Michael was 13 years old, Thomas Rookwood began preparations for the most dangerous act of his life. He contacted an investigative journalist in Philadelphia, a woman named Laura Brennan, who had built her career on exposing corruption in powerful families. He told her he had evidence of crimes spanning 5 generations. He told her the Rookwood family had been hiding something in their basement since 1837, and he told her he was willing to show her everything, but it had to happen before his son's 15th birthday. He had less than 2 years. Brennan was skeptical at first. She had heard countless conspiracy theories and false leads. But when Thomas began sending her documents, medical records with inconsistencies, death certificates with suspicious patterns, journal entries written in the handwriting of men long dead, she realized this was something beyond anything she had encountered. In the spring of 1988, she traveled to Ashford with a cameraman and a lawyer. Thomas met them at a hotel outside of town. He brought a key to the Rookwood estate, and he brought something else: detailed maps of the basement levels that existed beneath the house. What they found when they entered that basement has been partially documented. though much of the evidence was later sealed by court order. Brennan's initial article, published in 1989, described a room approximately 30 feet underground, accessible only through a series of locked doors. Inside were medical instruments dating back to the mid-1800s. Journals written in the hand of Cornelius Rookwood, describing experiments that violate every principle of medical ethics established before or since. Preserved specimens, photographs, records of people, patients, servants, drifters who had entered the Rookwood home over the course of a century and had never left. The journals revealed what the Rookwood inheritance truly was. Each generation had continued the work of the previous. Cornelius had been conducting experiments on human subjects, attempting to understand pain, consciousness, and the limits of the human body. Edmund had expanded this work. Thaddeus had refined it. Samuel had modernized the techniques. Richard had documented everything with photographic precision. And each son, upon turning 15, had been brought into the basement and shown the results of 5 generations of systematic torture masked as medical inquiry. Each son had been told this was their legacy, their duty, their secret to keep and pass forward. Thomas's exposure destroyed the Rookwood name. The estate was seized. Criminal investigations were opened, though most of the perpetrators were long dead. Thomas himself was never charged. Prosecutors determined he had been a victim, psychologically coerced from childhood. But the town of Ashford never forgave him. He was called a liar by those who refused to believe such things could happen in their community. He was called a traitor by distant relatives who valued the family name more than the truth. Catherine divorced him in 1990, taking Michael and disappearing into a new life under a new name. Thomas Rookwood died in 2006, alone in a small apartment 3 states away from Pennsylvania. He was 59 years old. Cause of death was listed as suicide. In his final letter, found beside his body, he wrote only this: "I broke the pattern. Whatever else I failed to do, I broke the pattern. Michael will never know what I knew. The Rookwood line ends with me." And it did. Michael, now living under a different name, has never spoken publicly about his family. The Rookwood estate was demolished in 1992. The basement was filled with concrete. The land was sold and subdivided. Today, there are houses there, normal houses where normal families live, completely unaware of what existed beneath that ground for over 150 years. But the question remains, how many other families are out there, still passing their secrets from father to son, still maintaining traditions that should have ended generations ago? How many basements are there, in how many towns, hiding how many years of carefully preserved horror? Thomas Rookwood found the courage to expose his family's sins, but he paid for that courage with his entire life. And somewhere in America tonight, another son is turning 15, and another father is preparing to show him something he will never be able to forget. If this story affected you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the most dangerous secrets are the ones that families keep.